Everyone, welcome. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies. Thanks for being with us today for the last event of the Spring's Dean Speaker Series. And what a great way to conclude. I am thrilled today to be talking with a very special person, the 64th Secretary of State of the United States, professor, diplomat, author, businesswoman, Madeleine Albright. So welcome, Madam Secretary. As I'm sure most of you know, Madeleine Albright was the first female Secretary of State of the United States from 1997 to 2001. At that time, she was the highest ranking woman in our nation's history. She's had just an extraordinary career. In addition to being Secretary of State, former U.S. Representative to the United Nations, chair of the National Democratic Institute, chair of the Albright-Stonebridge Group, a consulting firm. She had 7-time New York Times bestselling author and recipient of the Presidential Medal of Honor, to name just a few highlights. But for us, most importantly, Secretary Albright is the daughter of Josef Korbel, diplomat, scholar, and founder of what is now the Korbel School of International Studies. Before we begin our conversation, though, I'm delighted to also welcome and introduce the Chancellor of the University of Denver, Jeremy Haefner, to offer his words of welcome. Jeremy Haefner is the 19th Chancellor of the University of Denver. Before becoming Chancellor 1 year ago, Jeremy served as DU's Provost. In both roles, he's advanced DU's strategic plan, DU Impact 2025, and has created new programs for a holistic, student-centered educational experience that prepares our graduates for successful careers and meaningful lives. He's passionate about DU's long legacy of fearless innovation and ethical leadership. And I would add he's done a wonderful job of steering this university during the COVID crisis we now find ourselves in. So thanks for joining us today, Jeremy.
Well, thank you, Fritz. It is absolutely a delight to just be a part of this wonderful occasion and to acknowledge our dear, dear friend, Madam Secretary Albright here. Madam Secretary, you are always an inspiring legend for this university. You gave the 2016 commencement address to our undergraduates. The family connection, as Fritz just mentioned, is deep and long lasting and incredibly meaningful for us. And of course, the arc of your leadership is something that we can just be incredibly proud of. But on a more personal note, I have always been delighted to get to know you as a person behind the legend just a little bit. And I've had the fortunate opportunities to visit you in your DC office and see some of the memorabilia that is on your walls. Your Medal of Freedom plaque and your other awards that are prominently shown up there. The ship manifest from the time when your family came over to the United States. But I'll tell you the biggest joy that I had in listening to your stories was the stories of your family, your father and your mother, and how you came to the United States and how special that is. I particularly like the story about your palm reading mother, and I do hope that we get to hear that a little bit more. So thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to the dialogue that's about to happen. So Fritz, back to you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and again, welcome, Secretary Albright. It's just wonderful to have you with us today. Before we start, let me just tell the audience, the plan is we'll speak for about 40 minutes, Madeleine and I, and then we'll take some questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A button to type in your question, and we'll try to include it. So Madeleine, you've so much to talk about. You've written a very engaging new book, Hell and Other Destinations, a provocative title, which is a memoir of your life after leaving the State Department. It's full of all kinds of vignettes and insights into any number of things, and certainly a demonstration that you have found a way to continue to have your voice heard. But one of the things you write about in that book is your background, and maybe we should start there with your childhood, the time you spent in London, the story of how you ended up coming to Denver.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to you and the Chancellor, and really the welcome. And I'm delighted to have an opportunity. When people ask me really where I'm from, I always say Denver. But there is a previous story to that. And what happened was I was born in 1937 in Czechoslovakia. And my father was a Czechoslovak diplomat. And when the Nazis marched in March 1939, he and my mother and I escaped to go to London. And the Czechoslovak government in exile was in London. And we lived through all the Blitz in the cellar of the apartment house we lived in on Notting Hill Gate before that got to be a fancy place. And my father's job was to broadcast over BBC into Czechoslovakia. And so I, as a little girl, listened to BBC. Actually, I thought he was in the radio. The experience, I think, in terms of being there, even as a little girl, I started my movie career by being a refugee child in a movie that the British Red Cross put on. And later in the war, we moved out of town to Walton-on-Thames, and I was a very proper little English girl. And then what happened after the war, we went back to Czechoslovakia, and my father was the chief of staff to Foreign Minister Masaryk, and then he was made ambassador to Yugoslavia. They had been in Yugoslavia before the war as diplomats, and so we were there, and the little girl in the national costume that gave flowers at the airport, that's what I did for a living. And my father didn't want me going to school with communists, so I had a governess, and I got ahead of myself, and so my parents sent me to Switzerland to go to school for a year. And I'll never forget my parents coming through in the spring of 1948 saying that they weren't going back to Yugoslavia or Czechoslovakia. And what happened, my father had just gotten a new assignment to be the new Czechoslovak representative to a new United Nations Commission on India and Pakistan to do with Kashmir. And he was delighted to do that. And then all of a sudden the communists took over. And he wasn't sure he wanted to work. He knew he didn't want to work with communists. And his best friends in Belgrade were the British and American ambassadors. And they said, if you resign, they'll name some communist and nothing will happen. And so don't report to your own government. So what happened is we went to England and came to the United States on, there's no terrible story in terms of crawling through barbed wire. We came as on diplomatic passports. And my father came a little bit later. And when he came to the United States, he defected and asked for political asylum. What happened when I was in office, I got a copy of the letter that he had written in which he said, beg for political asylum. And he got the political asylum. And at that stage, what happened was that the Rockefeller Foundation was finding jobs for Central European intellectuals or whatever. And they found him a job at the University of Denver. And we had no idea where Denver was. Started driving across America. And my mother said, they say it's the Mile High City, but we're not going up. So maybe we're going the wrong direction. We arrived in Denver, and my parents loved Denver and were so grateful to be there. And that's how we ended up in Denver, Colorado, in the summer of 1949.
Wow, that's such a, well, thank goodness for that, for all that's happened since then. So you grew up then in Denver, and what was Denver at that time like?
Well, I have to say it was kind of it was a very kind of small town, but, and this is what's so interesting, and I think very much worth telling anybody associated with the university, is that it had an international reputation in many ways and was internationally minded, and it had to do with the founders of the school, Ben Charrington and Heber Harper, who were very interested in international relations and foreign policy. And even though the town itself was very meager and small, it did have this reputation. And so my parents were so thrilled to be there, loved everything about it. And my mother, on a regular basis, later would say there are only two great cities in the world, Prague and Denver. But they really wanted to be a part, and I'll never, ever forget my father saying this on a regular basis, that there was nothing better than to be a professor in a free country. And so there were all kinds of stories always about what he could have been if he'd stayed in Czechoslovakia, you know, and if there'd been a democratic government. But he kept saying, there's nothing better, as I said, to be a professor in a free country. And so really pleased and honored and grateful to be in the United States and at the University of Denver.
Well, that's, I also subscribe to that view. What a great privilege it is to be a professor in a free country. You know, your background is so fascinating, and you know, it comes through in the book, your lifelong focus on an interest in promoting democracy. I mean, this is your father's work, of course, before you. And I'm just curious. I mean, there are a couple of questions we could have, and one is just the you know, where we are in terms of our attitude towards immigrants. I mean, as an immigrant, you and I, my father was an immigrant, and he too became a professor in America. So this really resonates with me. But you know, we've gotten to the point where you know, there's tremendous animus in this country, indeed around the world, towards immigrants. And I guess the question is sort of how you react to that, and what advice do you have about how we get back to our better angels on this issue?
Well, I think that we all know that most of the people in the United States are immigrants and various generations. And I think the diversity that's provided by immigrants is the strength of America. When we came to America, I came on this ship, the SS America, and we sailed by the Statue of Liberty. And to this day, I remember that, and I love going out to the Statue of Liberty. And this country and how much we wanted to be citizens. It wasn't simple, frankly. And I have to tell that story because, as I mentioned, technically there was a period that my father had been associated with a communist government, even though he had not didn't report to them or anything. And we were trying to get our citizenship during the McCarthy era. And I'll never forget this, is that we were being questioned. And my brother, my youngest sibling, was a little brother. We were there at the Denver court. And I remember they were asking my father, have you ever been the question. And so he said, no. And my little brother says, now tell the truth, Daddy. And when we left, my father, oh my God, imagine if that had happened in any other country. But I think that becoming a citizen was a very important part. And when I went to college, I was not yet a citizen. I didn't become a citizen until between my sophomore and junior year at Wellesley. And I studied all the various immigration laws, and I understand the following thing, that every country has a right to make decisions about immigration. And I think that there are periods that we have been more generous than other times. I don't think anything has been as bad as what is going on now, where in fact there is this tendency to blame immigrants for all kinds of things, and really disgusting, if I might say so, is the way that rapists and drug dealers and all kinds of horrible categorization of immigrants. I do think that I have now said, as there have been a variety of bans against a variety of immigrants, that the Statue of Liberty is weeping, and that this is un-American. And something that was in the papers today was a decision to delay naturalization ceremonies for a whole group of people, even though I think they do think it could be done virtually, so they can't vote. And so this goes on in terms of discrimination against immigrants. And in many ways, I think it's un-American. That's the only thing I can say about it. I do think we need comprehensive immigration legislation, but not walls or scapegoating immigrants, and to understand the value that immigrants bring. And I describe myself as a grateful American in every single way. And my parents were behind that in terms of really saying, you have to be grateful to be here. But the other thing that my father used to say is that he was worried that Americans took democracy for granted, and that one really can't do that, that it's essential to understand that democracy is not a spectator sport, and how important it is to participate. But I learned so many things by being a refugee and living in Denver. We kept moving around from one faculty housing to another. I can tell you every address I lived at in Denver, but gratitude in terms of being able to be a free American.
Yeah, well, let me pick up on the theme of taking democracy for granted. You know, a theme of your book and indeed of your life has been, as I mentioned earlier, the concern with the health of democracy and promoting democracy. And you certainly were active in that at the UN and as Secretary of State, and more recently, I guess in particular, maybe in chairing the National Democratic Institute and a variety of other efforts. So as you look, I mean, there was a period, of course, where we thought we saw democracy on the rise around the world, the 80s and the 90s. But of course, in recent years, the picture has been a little more bleak, and it does feel that democracy is on the wane. What do you you know, what is the reason behind this sort of rise and then an apparent fall in democracy around the world?
Well, it is something that has concerned me. And so the book I wrote just before this one is called Fascism, a Warning, very bland title. And I decided to try to figure out, basically, I wanted to know what was going on now in terms of division in society, and to try to answer the question that you asked, and what is the reason for authoritarian governments having all of a sudden sprouted. And I have been a part of the National Democratic Institute since it was started in the early 80s. And there was such a sense of euphoria about democracy, and that many countries were ready for democratic institutions. And yet it obviously was harder than we thought. And I do think in my analysis of this is that there are divisions in society, there's no question. And many of them come as a result of the economy and technology, which has both positive and negative aspects, but negative in terms of jobs and questions about are people trained in order to be able to exist in a new technological environment? What does globalization do? But what has happened is that there have been leaders who have taken advantage of that division in society to exacerbate it. So I went back and I looked at the birth of fascism, and people know it started with Mussolini after World War I. Italy had in fact fought on the side of the Allies, but it was not respected. It had economic problems, and this outsider, Mussolini, comes in. He was a very good speaker and somebody that was able to take advantage of the divisions and make them worse, exacerbate them. Fascism is not an ideology. It's a process for gaining power. And what it is for this demagogic leader is to take advantage of the divisions by identifying himself, by the way, they're all hymns, to ally with those at the expense of another group, that then become the scapegoats who are the problem. And the person thinks that he's above the law, that the press is the enemy of the people, that doesn't want to have any disagreement. And so, by the way, the best quote in that book is from Mussolini, who said that if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices. And so I think there's a lot of feather plucking going on right now. And by the way, you can't say those two words together too quickly.
That's a dangerous one. Now, there's a lot of commentary at the moment in the midst of this pandemic that that there have been, much as you just described, leaders around the world who are seizing this moment to even further undermine democracy. Is that what you see?
Yes, I do. And if you look at it in terms of the examples that I've used, Orban in Hungary, who is taking advantage of, first of all, the migrants that have been coming in from the Middle East, then also now, to some extent, the virus, closing borders, taking advantage in order to have decrees of complete power. We have the same things going on in the Philippines with Duterte, also to some extent in Venezuela, and in Venezuela and in Brazil, I'm sorry to say, also. And I think it is a way of dividing the people and blaming somebody else. And so I did say the reason I wrote the book was a warning, and that what needed to happen was people can't be silent. We have to call out what it is and try to figure out why it happened. I'm particularly troubled when I see some of the things in Central and Eastern Europe where there really was so much hope. And I think the example that Orban is presenting, and to some extent what's happening in Poland, is something that we have to watch out for, which is why I have it as a warning, and I have my to-do list that goes with that. But I really do think we have to watch, and it's that instead of trying to find unity and trying to solve problems together, this demagogic leader takes advantage of that division and makes it even worse.
Let me just building on that picture, bring it closer to home. So you're, in hell and other destinations. You resist calling Donald Trump a fascist, but write that he's the quote he has the most anti-democratic instincts of any president in modern American history. Why do you say that? And why does the president need democratic instincts?
Well, I think that a president needs to understand, an American president especially, what this country is based on. And it has some very important principles in the way that we see the government, how the freedom of the press is basic to democracy. And the leaders that I admire are those who try to solve problems, not make them worse. And I just, every day in some form or another, I think that I had some hopes for Trump. I don't. I think he's undemocratic, and I think he's un-American, because he doesn't understand what this country is based on and is exacerbating the differences. And I think also kind of moral equivalence about those who, the Charlottesville, that there were good people on both sides, and kind of a lack of understanding what are the motivating factors. And it troubles me deeply because I am such a grateful American, and I am so proud to have been able to come here. And then the whole motto of my life is to give back. I'm honored to be an American. I loved sitting behind a sign that said the United States. And at the moment, we are AWOL. We are not doing things internationally that are not only good for our people, but also for what is happening in the world with a virus that knows no borders.
Let me pick up on that. I mean, it's been said that this is the first crisis in 75 years that that the world has not looked at the U.S. for leadership. Why does that matter? What?
It does matter. Let me just say, and again, we all are products of our backgrounds, and I probably more visibly than others, given what we're talking about, my father and where we came from. And so, as I said, I was born in 1937. As a Czechoslovak, a watershed event was Munich. And it was an agreement made by the British and French with the Germans and Italians over the heads of the Czechoslovaks. And the country was sold down the river. America was not there at that stage, not interested. Then we did go to England. And as a little girl, I will never forget what it was like when the American soldiers came. And that's, by the way, when I first fell in love with Americans in uniform. And it it made such a difference. I remember the atmosphere completely, even though I was little. Then learning from history that when, as a result of agreements made during World War II, Europe was divided and the country that I was born in was behind the Iron Curtain. And I can go through a whole history of what happens when the US is not present. Now, I also, and it was fascinating to be at the UN when I was there during the early 90s. And it was very interesting because President Clinton was the first one to say that we were the indispensable nation. And he said it first, but I said it so often it became identified with me. But there's nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. It means we need to be engaged. And Americans are not imperialists. We don't want to run the world. So we have to be, in some ways, urged and to understand that it is, in many ways, our responsibility to be a partner to others. So all of a sudden, deciding that we're absent and we're not only not leading, but undermining some of the agreements that have been made to deal with issues that are out there that have to be solved by countries together: climate change, nuclear proliferation, and now dealing with pandemics. You don't have to be a genius to know that you need to operate with other countries to do that. So I am deeply troubled. And by the way, I was at the Munich Security Conference in March for a joke, an absolute joke. Pompeo and the Secretary of Defense came. They were like from some other planet and did not even explain what is going on in the 21st century.
Well, I share your frustration or your views on the importance of our ability to cooperate with others. I'm sure there were moments in your time at the UN when it's frustrating to deal with international organizations and all of the other agencies and organizations and alliances, and yet they are essential, aren't they, for solving the kind of global problems that you just mentioned?
No question, but I've been saying with some experience that people and institutions in their 70s need a little refurbishing. And I do think the UN does. It's the 75th anniversary of the Charter, and there are issues that need to be dealt with. But the US, it is based on nation states. In order to have an influence on whatever changes there are, you have to be at the table. And I'll give you an example from my own experience. What happened when I was there are two main budgets for the UN. One is the main budget that is based, it's like being dues to a club. And then the other one is the peacekeeping budget that obviously is also based on a percentage. And we were behind on that when I got there. And then unilaterally, Congress decided not to pay the amount that we were supposed to pay. At the same time, I kept getting instructions about doing something about reform. And it led our best friends, the British, to deliver a line they'd waited more than 200 years to say, which was representation without taxation. So if you are there undermining the system, you in fact don't have the leverage. So at the moment, I do think there are things that need to be done about the World Health Organization. But if we decide that we're not only not going to fund it, that we're not going to be at the table, what kind of voice do we have there? And, you know, just that cliche, if the UN didn't exist, we'd probably try to invent it at this point. But it does need work. We need to be a part of it in partnership, not in being a bully and thinking that everything is a zero-sum game, or have a president that goes and talks only about sovereignty, 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 and in ways became a laughingstock. Very sad what's going on. So we need to help in refurbishing that institution.
So,
I did win the United Nations when I was a sophomore in high school. The United Nations contest for the whole Rocky Mountain Empire. Able to do that, I was able to name the 51 countries that were members of the UN in alphabetical order. Now it would be a little harder with over 100.
That's fantastic. Staying at the international stage, for many years we've been imagining the world becoming increasingly globalized, and I think the dream was in some ways on the U.S. model, a kind of a liberal international order with relatively open borders and free trade and the like. Is the era of globalization over?
Well, I hope not, because, you know, now globalization is kind of seen as a four-letter word, but it is basically shows that it's hard to have borders everywhere, and that there's certain issues that do have to be handled through globalization. I think there is a problem. I've often talked about two mega trends and their downside. One mega trend is globalization, and obviously most of us, especially people that go to the Korbel School or are diplomats, you know, in many ways are people that, or the private sector that operates internationally, are beneficiaries. There's a downside to it, which is faceless. And so people want to know what their identity is, and which is fine. I think we all want to know that. But if my identity hates your identity, it turns into nationalism, and hyper-nationalism is dangerous. And the other global trend I mentioned just briefly was technology. And the advantages to that, I always like to talk about the Kenyan woman farmer who no longer has to walk zillions of miles to pay her bills, because she can pay them with her mobile phone, and she can get an education or start a business or spend time with her family and be a participant. The downside is that it has disaggregated voices, and therefore it is hard for people to know where their information comes from, and how they are figuring out what the real truth is. And by the way, this is a line that's totally plagiarized, and I always admit that, and I got it from Silicon Valley, is that people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments are listening to them on 20th century technology and providing 19th century responses. And so we have to update our institutions. We need to understand how they fit with globalization and technology and the interdependence that is there. There's no way. And, you know, and nothing is proving this more than the virus. There's no question. It does not know boundaries. And the only way that it's going to be dealt with is by cooperation and science.
So you write also in your recent book that globalization has been more efficient than fair. You know, really looking at the economic side of things. How important is that as a driver of the backlash or the pushback against globalization?
I think it is fair. I think it is hard. I think the hard part just generally is, you know, whether capitalism is fair, or what is it that one does to try to worry about the fact that there are classes of people that don't have the opportunities that everybody does. To what, you know, to put it in terms is the social contract has been broken. People, as we all know from studying political philosophy, people gave up some individual rights in order to have the government deal with certain issues that are needed by a whole society. But in addition to that, there's the responsibility of the citizens. And so there's been a disconnect in all of that. I think what we want is fair trade, I think. And there is an awful lot of unfairness that's going on in many society. And the hard part, and again, I'm harking back to what it was like to come to America. And I'll never forget my father saying, this is a middle-class country. And he was so surprised, you'll appreciate this, that when he saw his students waiting on tables or pumping gas, when people actually used to do that for you, and saying that would never happen in Europe because the intelligentsia would not be doing that. And what was so incredible about the US in the 50s was the aspect of being a middle-class country and not having the 1% and then everybody else. And so I do think that there have to be some adjustments that are fairer, that are more representative of the fact that we are a democracy.
So many threads we could pick up on. I'd be remiss, maybe, since you touched briefly on trade and the economy. Perhaps we could talk a few minutes about China. Probably the U.S.-China relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. It will be for some time. We're at a difficult juncture in that relationship, for sure. There had been hopes, of course, that when China joined the WTO and other international organizations, there would be a liberalizing factor. How if you were the Secretary of State today, how would you balance on the one hand, the concerns about human rights and China's increasingly aggressive stance in many realms, with our need to cooperate with China and engage with China on things like climate change and the economy?
Well, the art of statecraft is trying to do exactly that, trying to figure out where are the areas that you can cooperate or must cooperate, and other areas where there will be competition and confrontation. There's no question that the Chinese are on a ego trip of their own in terms of thinking about how nationalism can be used to support the one-party system and communism, and then pull out all the arguments they have with the way they have been treated by the West over the years, and that they need to be respected. And I can't tell you how many meetings I've been to in the last few years that talk about what is our relationship with China and all that. When President Obama decided to rebalance and spend some time on Asia, I used to say the U.S. is not monogamous. We are an Atlantic and Pacific power. And it's important for us to have a functioning relationship with China. And when I was in office, there were issues that we disagreed on, and I would go and I didn't go to any meeting that I didn't talk about the importance of human rights and how one treats minorities, and generally in terms of where we had problems. But then also I was interested in knowing what direction they were going in and trying to actually have a dialogue. I do think I'm very worried about what is going on now. I also have to tell you, and I think most of our audience and you have followed every campaign, the Chinese are always the butt of anger during a campaign. There's no question. And then once you're in office, you have to try to figure out how to deal with them. It isn't easy. I think that at the moment we are at a very bad crossroads. The whole issue with Hong Kong and really, again, exacerbating some of the issues. But I do think there are areas we have to cooperate on climate change. And by the way, there has to be some investigation of how the whole virus started. But at the moment, just imagine if the Chinese were the first ones to develop the vaccine. Would we say we wouldn't want to use it? So trying to deal with the pandemic, then on climate change, I think very important. And there are issues that we have to deal with, but their behavior in terms of what's going on in the South China Sea, what they've just done with Hong Kong, their behavior towards the Uyghurs, and the way they have their Belt and Road policy. I've been saying the Chinese must be getting very fat because the belt is getting larger and larger. They are in all kinds of places, and I think that they are a genuine problem for the United States. But statecraft is being able to figure out where we can cooperate and where we must compete. And at the moment, I think we're in just anger and acting as though there's no way that we can cooperate, which I think is a mistake.
So as you look across the world, I'm curious, if your father was here, what would Josef Korbel think of this moment? What would he see that was similar to and parallels to his time, and what would be different?
Well, believe it or not, this is something that we all talk about with my brother and sister, and talk a lot about what he might do. I think that he would talk about a combination of things, the fragility of democracy, but also the resiliency of democracy, and understanding history, and the role of the United States. I think that he really did see this as an exceptional country, and also the importance of using the tools that are out there. He was a diplomat, and there was a way that one behaves in diplomacy. And then also, I think he was a historian, and understanding what creates a particular situation. But I think he would be so sad if he saw what was going on, and he would try to figure out what he could do. I think one of the things, and I try to remember the lessons, is he loved young people. And so I'm often asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. Optimistic are the young people, our students, and what they're going to do. And I think my father would be thinking about that. But some of the things that I talked about, that he believed in the middle class aspect of this country and the goodness of America and the importance of American engagement, would be his mantra on a lot of this. And I think he would be very proud of the things that you all are doing at the University of Denver, and understanding the role of democracy and involvement and international outreach. By the way, the Chancellor was asking what it was like to adapt with my parents in this country. They really, it wasn't easy. I so badly just wanted to be an American and stuff. And so my mother was the most delightful person, and very engaging, but at dinner parties, she would sit down next to a man and start reading his palm, and then didn't seem to have any control mechanism. And while the man's wife was sitting on the other side, she would say to him, "And you are going to have many affairs." She thought that I was going to have 3 sons. I have 3 daughters. And she told me when she read my palm that I didn't have a brain line. So she might have been right about that. But my father, he also wanted to fit in Colorado, which meant fishing. So we went to the mountains every Sunday to look at the mountains, and so he could fish. But he always wore a coat and tie while he was fishing, which was very European diplomatic. And something I'll never forget, we were up in Aspen and went to Maroon Bells, and he was fishing there, and there's a big echo, and he had an accent, and he caught a fish, and he said, I got one. And there were a bunch of teenage boys there, and all of a sudden they started saying, I got one. So I grew up with this crazy family who loved to be Americans, and we're very grateful to be in America and in Denver.
Oh, what a lovely story. We promised those in the audience we would take some of their questions. So why don't we take a few minutes to do that? I'll just, we have quite a number, and we don't have time. So my apologies to all of you who've written questions that we don't get to, but let me get to a few. So one is, the first one is from Connie Oswald, who's a Korbel PhD, 2002. She asks, how will our government's new initiative in information warfare change the way foreign policy is conducted when so much of the struggle for power and control is happening in the cyber arena? Who will create the legal and ethical boundaries around such policies and actions? How will these legal and ethical boundaries be negotiated or monitored? Big question.
Very big question, and a very important one. And it is really, one needs to look a little bit at the history of how agreements in difficult issues have been made before. Arms control agreements, for instance, I think are an example of some things, and trying to find some common understanding. I do think that there are a number of different aspects, and one of the things that I have been actually agitating about is the role of the private sector, because a lot, obviously, the tools of information are under the private sector's aegis, as we're seeing in terms of the kinds of things that are going on with Twitter now, or just generally in terms of the spreading of information. And so I do think that there needs to be some effort, and I have been helping on this a little bit, is kind of to develop some kind of an international system for this in terms of a convention where there is a way of looking at how information, how it's created, what is its genesis, what are the rules, how has privacy worked. But I think it has to be a combination of working with some existing institutions like us with the European Union, or trying to figure out, and also the private sector. The problem is the outliers and those who are using information, not just deliberately, accidentally spreading information, but deliberately using it as a tool to undermine democracy. And I think we do have to remember that in dealing with the Russians specifically, we're dealing with a former KGB agent. He knows how to use information to undermine democracy. And we have not, when I teach now, and I do my national security toolbox, we're spending a lot of time examining cyber warfare and how it needs to be controlled, what are the rules of the game. But it's very difficult, there's no question. And it takes people that have some sense of history and how to create some kind of international norms. But it is the newest problem that we have to deal with because it does undermine our whole way of life.
Thanks. Here's a related question from Nicholas Gorgistani, who is an alum of what was then GSIS, who writes, as a student of Professor Korbel, I learned a lot about the Soviet Union from him. What would he advise the current US president about policy on Russia in general and Putin in particular?
Well, I think he would say, let's start from the beginning. How did the Soviet Union happen? What is communist theory about a useful idiot in terms of using people that don't understand what the Soviet Union and its successor in different ways in the current government? And he would spend a lot of time on that. And I think that I thought a lot about how he would have felt at the end of the Cold War, whether he would have approved of some of the things that I was involved in. I think he would have in terms of expanding NATO. And what it was like, I would have wanted to tell him what it was like to go to Russia and pretend I didn't speak Russian. So understand all they were saying, and Yeltsin saying, don't keep translating, she understands us. But I think that we were trying at the end of the Cold War to reach out and try to figure out whether there was something that could be done about the new Russia. And I think in many ways, he would have been more of a warning sign on it. But I think he would be telling it very straight that we need to be very nervous about what the Russians are doing.
Christian Mehta, who serves on the board, the SSF board with your brother John, writes, Paul Krugman recently wrote a column arguing that the ability to acknowledge mistakes is a trait of real leadership. Looking back at your time in the Clinton administration and how history has turned out, are there some things that could have been done differently during that period in Iraq, in NATO expansion, in the Middle East?
Well, I think that obviously there are things that could have been done differently, but we were living in a very fascinating time in terms of in a very different situation, and some of it specifically to do with Russia. I think that I'm glad we expanded NATO. I spent a lot of time, we've been criticized for doing that, but then I think people need to understand what would have happened if these countries that have been part of the Warsaw Pact that wanted to be part of an alliance of democracies, if we'd said no way, just be kind of no man's land. So I think we did the right thing, but there certainly are people who criticize that. I do think that we worked very, very hard on the Middle East. There's no question about that. I have said to people, if I were to invite you to Camp David, you'd probably say yes. I can tell you that after 2 weeks in the rain with the Israelis and Palestinians in the summer of 2000, I never want to go back. I mean, really did try to present some bridging proposals and various ideas, but unless the leaders there want to do something, nothing really happens. I do think something that I regret, even though I wasn't secretary at the time, but trying what we didn't do in Rwanda, and the whole role of peacekeeping and how you deal with it, and now it's kind of expansion into responsibility to protect. How much can we be involved in affairs of other countries? But I think I love teaching about this because, and I think you also as a professor is trying to get students to understand that you make decisions in a particular setting and you try to deal with the unintended consequences of them, and you look at the trade-offs, and nobody sits there trying to make stupid decisions. What you try to do is to think about what your responsibilities are to your country, but at the same time, what the effects are of not making a decision, which sometimes is as bad as making the wrong one. And I do think that goes over everything constantly. So I'm willing to admit mistakes, but I'm actually very proud of a lot of the things we were able to do in the Clinton administration.
Well, I know from my much more limited time in government that so different from the textbooks, the pace at which things happen and the need to make decisions with ultimately imperfect information is quite different from the academic world for sure. What let me ask a couple more here in the time we have. So a couple of questions around one from Linda Jashovnik. What concrete steps do you feel the next president, assuming it isn't Trump, must take to repair our relationships with allies and foster return to global cooperation?
I think that what is very important, and I very much hope that it's going to be President Biden, because he is somebody that has spent his life studying diplomatic relations and understanding our relationship, the importance of our relationships with allies, of having respect, of understanding that institutions need to be dealt with. But I think that I have mentioned before the embarrassment about America being AWOL. I think that we need to be there, not as a force that tells everybody what to do and seeing things as a zero-sum game, but as a problem solver and working on issues that actually need cooperation, and to understand that we're better off if we're dealing with agreements like the Paris Agreement on climate change, or trying to figure out who our friends and partners are in terms of dealing with some of the very difficult issues in the Middle East, and seeing things as partnerships and having a bit of humility, but understanding the importance of the relationships and that they're not a sign of weakness. I know Americans don't like the word multilateralism. I mean, it has too many syllables and it ends in an isn't, but it's basically just partnerships. And that's what I want to see, is that we see what needs to be done in the 21st century on dealing with one of those questions of technology and information, on dealing with the fact that there's poverty in some countries and people who are the international homeless who can't live in, most people want to live where they were born and not try to find a place to live. So yes, I hope very much that the next president understands the importance of American partnership.
That's great. We're over 100 questions here being posed, so we will not get to all of them for sure. Let me from Allison Bauer, what advice would you give women who are trying to move up the ladder in a corporate environment traditionally dominated by men? She works in aerospace, she says.
Well, I think first of all, we have to encourage each other. And actually the reason for the title of my book, Hell and Other Destinations, comes from the most famous thing I ever said, which is that there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other. So I do think that that is a very important part. I think we should not be so judgmental about each other. We need to support each other. And there's no way to actually make a specific plan about one's life. I do think what's interesting, and I've enjoyed talking about this, is that there are a number of countries now where they have been able to deal with the coronavirus, and they're all ones run by women. New Zealand, Germany, Taiwan, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Iceland. And I think that one of the traits that we do have is being able to multitask, which means that we have peripheral vision. And I do think that we don't particularly want our families to fight with each other. So the kind of exacerbation of differences, but I do think we need to help each other. That doesn't mean, and I've been misunderstood on this, that I would vote for a woman that I disagreed with. I am not talking about voting. I'm talking about understanding that when there's more than one woman in a room, you have a capability of being supportive of each other's ideas and not belittling them, but trying to explain how we can all work together. I am very much for that. I know I'm sometimes asked what the world would be like if it were only run by women. If that were true, you'd forgotten high school. I think it's important actually for men and women to work together to be problem solvers.
Well, in the spirit of the problem of working together, one more from Daniel Magnan. How concerned should we be about the hyperpartisanship and the relative nature of truth in our government and our country in the 21st century?
I'm very concerned about that. I believe in bipartisanship. I think the strength of the United States has been bipartisanship. I proved that by working with Jesse Helms, and also, by the way, on democracy, by working with Senator McCain. He was of the Republican Institute when I as Democratic chairman, and I believe in bipartisanship. We can look at things differently, but the kind of denigration of the other party, I think, is counterproductive and leads to what I really do think is the major problem of exacerbating the differences and creating an angry population. We need people who know what the responsibilities of a citizen are, how we operate, and to cooperate in trying to solve problems, not make them.
Well, it's certainly a theme of ours at the Korbel School, really trying to help our students navigate that partisan world. We're almost out of time, so I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your pin. In fact, I promised my mother I would do that. I've noticed you've worn the same pin, I think, for a number of the talks you've given on your virtual book tour. Tell us about your pin. I know pins are part of your arsenal. You've written a whole book about this.
Definitely. Well, I'll tell you, I mean, the book was written before the whole issue with the virus. And I was actually going to wear a devil pin for this book tour. But I decided the following thing, and especially since I wrote about World War II at the beginning of the book, and I talked about my father working for BBC. So as a little girl, as I said, I listened to it. And what happened was the BBC broadcasts would always open with a kettle drum of the first notes of Beethoven's Fifth, da-da-da-doom, which in Morse code is victory. And so I thought that's why I wore it. I also do think, and this goes back to kind of what I learned from my parents, and that is their experience during World War II. I think they knew that they couldn't control the bombs. What they could control was their behavior and their attitude. We can't control how the virus started, but what we can do is control our behavior and our attitude. And so the combination of what I learned from my parents and the situation and understanding the difficulties of the problems that we have now, I do think we need to have an attitude that is positive, that is a problem-solving attitude, and to be grateful for being able to be active.
Well, what a wonderful message to end on. Secretary Albright, thank you so much for being with us today. Thanks for your inspiration. Thanks for a life of public service. And thank all of you today for joining us. I wish you good health, and safety. Again, thank you so much, Madeleine.
And
Real pleasure.
so much for everything you're doing at the Korbel School. My father loved DU and everything that he was doing in terms of teaching, and I will speak on his behalf, he would be very proud. And so thank you very, very much for everything, and thank you to everybody that was a part of this, and to the Chancellor and you. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. That means a great deal. All right. Be well.